Yeah, I wrote my dissertation at Tulane University on the religious philosophies of the American philosophers William James and Josiah Royce, who were contemporaries. They were friends. They both taught at Harvard University, and they both had very very different views of religion. Um, when I was at Tulane, one of the major areas of concentration in that department, and this was back in the 1960s, one of the major areas of concentration was American philosophy. So I took a number of American philosophy courses and was exposed to both of these philosophers and really felt that it would be interesting to do a study of the two of them and how they saw religion and how they interpreted religion. Uh, I I was introduced to the whole idea of NDEs by reading Raymond Moody's first book. And it really captured my imagination. I thought it was extremely interesting. I was aware of the fact that these kinds of experiences have been reported at various places at various times. At the end of the Republic, Plato actually tells a story about a warrior who is killed on the battlefield, apparently killed, and his body is on a funeral pyre. They're getting ready to cremate him when he comes to, and he tells a story about his near-death experience. I was also aware of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is a book read into the ear of a dying person to tell them what they're going to encounter when their soul goes to the Bardo plane. And so I was aware of these kinds of experiences and thought it was quite interesting that Raymond Moody had interviewed people who had these experiences in the contemporary world. And in developing a way of interpreting religious experience in my dissertation, I thought it would be interesting to look at the near-death experiences of people as an example of the religious experience, and how do we verify these experiences? How do we validate them? What do they mean? How can we put them into a context that makes sense? And so I devoted a whole chapter of my dissertation to looking at the religious experience using William James's approach and Josiah Royce's approach, and tried to come up with a sort of a theoretical context in which to place these kinds of experiences. I haven't had a near-death experience, but I've read a lot of books about this, and I've actually talked to several people, interviewed several people who've had these experiences. So it just seemed like a very fertile area to look at in exploring the whole idea of mystical experience. And I found that both William James and Josiah Royce had interesting things to say to help me make sense of these experiences. William James is a philosopher who I find quite interesting. He's a philosopher. He's best known, of course, for developing the American philosophy of pragmatism. But at the very beginning of the 20th century, he gave a series of lectures, which he put together in a book entitled The Varieties of Religious Experience. And it's a very compelling book because James is very open-minded. He's very willing to accept all kinds of ideas and experiences, and he tries to make sense of them. James doesn't actually talk about near-death experiences. He does talk about deathbed visitations. He talks about a variety of different kinds of mystical experiences, some that are spontaneous, some that are cultivated through the practice, for example, of yoga, some that are produced as a result of taking a psychedelic drug of some sort. James apparently experimented with psychedelic drugs such as ether and nitrous oxide and magic mushrooms, and his more staid and conservative brother, the novelist Henry James, was aghast that James, his brother, that William James, his brother, did this kind of thing. But William James apparently did have some mystical experiences. And what he tries to do in the varieties of religious experience is to argue that these experiences are revelatory, that they do suggest that there is something more beyond just our ordinary, everyday, mundane world. He says that if you haven't had the experience, that you're under no obligation to accept the accounts of these kinds of mystical experiences, but you can't just discount them, because many people have had these experiences throughout time, cross-culturally. So one of the things that I found very useful in using James to try to understand these experiences was his idea that truth is what works. This is a pragmatic theory of truth. That if a mystical experience has some real impact on your life, if it transforms you in some way, if it causes you to see the world in a different way and to act in a different way, that becomes some grounds on which you can claim that it is an authentic experience. It's not just some kind of hallucinatory, crazy experience. That there's something to it. And certainly in so many accounts of near-death experiences, people who've had these experiences say that the experiences are transformative, that they change their way of seeing the world, they change their way of acting. These experiences make them more loving. These experiences make them more understanding, kinder. And so, in terms of a Jamesian approach, this gives some grounds on which one could claim that these are authentic experiences, that they're not just dreamlike, hallucinatory experiences. So that was one of the factors that I really did explore in my dissertation. And I continued after I started teaching philosophy. I continued to be interested in this topic. I've always been interested in altered states of consciousness. I've read a lot of the works of Charles Tart, who was a psychologist at the University of California in Davis. He actually did some experiments to deal with autoscopic experiences, those experiences where a person feels that they have left their body and can actually look back on their physical body. And some of his experiments are very suggestive that this is really happening. Why do you say that? Well, for example, one of the experiments that Tart did was he worked with some subjects who claimed that they were able to leave their bodies through certain kinds of meditative practices. And in his lab, he would put them in a situation where they would be in a room with a light up on the ceiling, like a fluorescent light that had a flat top. He would put on top of that fluorescent light a series of randomly generated numbers. Then he would have the subject go into that out-of-body state. And apparently they were able to go up onto the ceiling and look down. And when they came back to ordinary consciousness, give him the numbers that were on the top of the fluorescent light. How do you explain that? The most obvious explanation is that they have somehow been able to separate their consciousness from their physical body and actually move up into a space where they could visualize an object, in this case, a series of numbers. So all of that's very, very provocative, very interesting. Personally, I've always been somewhat skeptical in the sense that I'm not willing to just accept the claims of people who've had these experiences, that they are real experiences that take them into another dimension, nor to reject. I don't just completely accept and I don't completely reject. I'm open. This was sort of the way James was, just open to possibilities. So that gives you some sort of an idea of where I stand in terms of looking at these kinds of experiences. Yeah, I was very lucky in the summer of 1981 and 1982. I had grants from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities to serve as a philosopher in residence at the Natchitoches Parish Hospital. I live in Natchitoches, Louisiana, which is a small town about an hour's drive south of Shreveport in northwest Louisiana. And this program was designed to put an academic humanist into a non-traditional setting, like a hospital or a business. And so my mission during those 2 summers was to give in-service programs to the hospital staff that deal, and these programs would deal not with medical issues, but with non-medical issues. So, for example, one week I would do a program on the importance of being sensitive to cultural differences in dealing with people who are ill. I dealt with certain ethical issues, such as euthanasia. And one of the workshops that I gave dealt with near-death experiences, because I had read enough about these experiences to know that people in hospitals sometimes will be declared, it looks like they're dead, and then they come back and they've had this experience. And we know from reading the literature on this topic that people are reluctant to talk about it, because when you start talking about a near-death experience, the people you're talking to may think you're crazy. So what I wanted to do in the program that I gave one week, and I think I did this the first summer, was to talk about this, to let the nurses and the doctors and other people who deal with patients know about it. And many of them had never heard about this. They didn't know about Raymond Moody's books. Several other books were written after Moody's books came out. one by Kenneth Ring, a psychologist, one by Michael Saban, who was I think he was a surgeon, and they were trying to go beyond just the anecdotal kind of thing that you find in Moody, to really make some sense of this, and to see if these experiences could be validated, especially the autoscopic experiences, where an autoscopic experience is where you leave your body and can actually view your physical body as if you were at a distance from it. So that was a really good experience, interacting with people in the hospital setting, mainly nurses. I think some of the physicians were not particularly interested in these workshops, but I did have some physicians one in particular, who came to almost every presentation that I gave on all of these non-medical aspects of healthcare. And as I continued to teach philosophy, I would often bring these up in talking about religion and looking at some of the accounts of near-death experiences in other religions and other cultures. So it's been a topic that I've been interested in since all the way back when I first read Moody back in I guess that came out somewhere in the 60s. Was it 75? I read it right after it came out, and just found it extremely. Moody was a philosophy professor, and I think he took a lot of heat for writing this book. But I've been off and on interested in it over the years. I actually had a nurse who had a near-death experience, and it wasn't one of these full-blown experiences. She just left her body for a period of time. And the story she told was extremely interesting. She was in her doctor's office. She had gotten a penicillin injection for an infection. And as she was leaving the office, she went into anaphylaxis and fell over on the floor in the waiting room. And she experienced leaving her body and looking down and seeing her body on the floor and seeing a man come out of the doctor's office and rush to her body and start performing CPR on her. And the one thing she vividly remembered was that he was bald. She came to, obviously, and when she was now back in her body, she interacted with the guy who had resuscitated her. And he was a young man with a lot of curly hair. And it puzzled her, because when she had left her body, she saw a bald man working on her. So she thought, that experience was I was just having some kind of hallucination. I wasn't really seeing my physical body. I wasn't really seeing someone resuscitating me. Several weeks later, she was in a department store, and she was going up an escalator. And as she was going up, she looked over at the down escalator and saw this young curly-headed man who had resuscitated her. He was going down, she was going up. And she turned as he went down, as he reached the bottom of the escalator. She turned and looked at him, and he had all this curly hair, but his head the top of his head was completely bald. And she said when she saw that, she was just frozen. She had to just stand at the head of the elevator and just sort of hold on there for a moment because it was such a shock. She realized that somehow she had seen that man's bald head. Even though she was lying on the floor, even though she was unconscious, this man was working on her, and she saw his bald head. How do you explain that? And she actually told that story when I was doing the presentation on the near-death experience. And it was really great because, the people who were there in the audience, the other nurses and a couple of doctors and a couple of staff people, were just sort of shocked that she had that experience. I also did talk to some nurses who had patients who had recounted some of these experiences and who had been very reluctant to talk about them because they thought, well, this is crazy. I don't know whether I should be talking about this. So, I had a student once who had a near-death experience, and I really can't remember the details of that experience. And I remember that when we were reading Plato and talking about the myth of the air at the very end of Plato, where this warrior apparently dies on the battlefield and then comes back to tell the story of going to this other world, and seeing the souls of individuals getting ready to be reincarnated. That he told that story in class. Well, and nurses spend a lot more time with patients. And often nurses will have more of a personal relationship with patients. So I think that might explain it. Although, sometimes a patient might actually talk to a housekeeper who's come to empty out the trash can. And I think that when a person has this kind of experience, I think when a person has any kind of really unusual experience, they're going to be reluctant to just talk about it unless they think that someone is really receptive and really willing to listen and not be judgmental and not say, well, that's crazy, or discount it. Certainly, another area that I'm really interested in is the work that's been done by Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. He's written a number of books about children who recall or report memories of previous existences. I think that sort of falls into the category of these kinds of near-death experiences. Stevenson has done a lot of research with these kids, and one of the things that he found was that when little kids, 2 or 3 years old, talk about previous existences, their parents are going to discount those accounts. Oh, no, you don't remember that. And so these memories, whatever they may be get sort of pushed below the surface, and they're not taken seriously, then the kid is not going to talk about them anymore. And I think you have that same kind of thing with near-death experiences. If a person has an NDE and is talking about it to someone who's not receptive and who's dismissive, they may just decide, hey, I'm going to shut up. I'm not going to talk about this to anybody because maybe this is just hallucinatory stuff that doesn't really have any significance. One of the things about students who take philosophy is that they tend to be inquisitive, They tend to be open to new ideas. Students who are scared of new ideas won't take philosophy. And so, generally speaking, they would be pretty open to talking about these kinds of things. And they would be exposed to so many unusual ideas in a philosophy class that they wouldn't think that this was particularly peculiar, or they wouldn't be too dismissive. Now, I will say this. I would from time to time have kids who were pretty hardcore evangelical Christians, and they might be resistant. I had one kid. I loved this kid, and I hated him too. He was an evangelical Christian, and he took almost every philosophy course that I took. And one day, he came into my office and he said, "Dr. Snowden, I pray for you every day because I know you're going to hell." And I said, "Joel, he was convinced of the truth. He took a course in logic and he objected because it wasn't Christian logic." And I said, "Joel, logic is logic. It's not bound down to any religion." I said, "Joel, why do you take all these philosophy courses if you're so convinced that you have the absolute truth and that I'm completely wrong when I talk about Hinduism or Buddhism or Taoism or Confucianism?" And he would say, I want to learn about my enemies." But for the most part, when I get into a discussion of this, students would be interested. I'm leaning in that direction. We recently read Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven, and it's a pretty compelling read. But I do believe that there is something in this, and that it is foolish to just discount these accounts. There's a very interesting book by Karol Zelensky, Otherworld Journeys, which is an attempt to show the degree to which cultural factors will color the narratives of these experiences. And what she does in that book is she compares medieval accounts of the near-death experience to more modern accounts. And she finds that there are cultural, religious, even economic factors which may sort of shape the narratives. But that in no way undermines the idea that the content of these narratives, which is fairly universal transculturally, has some legitimacy. And again, I go back to William James and the idea that a true experience is an experience that has some cash value, to use a term that he uses, that it has some payoff, that it has some consequences. And so if you have an experience like this and it radically changes you, then that suggests that there's something in that experience that's valid, that's authentic, that's real. So I'm leaning in that direction. I'm not a full-blown advocate, but I certainly think that there is something here that is significant. But these experiences have some meaning, and I go back to James. James says these experiences, whether they're deja vu experiences or experiences under the influence of nitrous oxide or spontaneous experiences, that they suggest that there is something more that is beyond just our everyday world, and that there is significance there, and that to understand maybe the purpose of human existence, we've got to go beyond just the sensory world here and now. Well, yeah, the absolute idealism, for example, uh, Hegel, uh, or a more recent philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, in Processing Reality. Uh, Whitehead was quite familiar with relativity physics. He was a mathematician. He and Bertrand Russell wrote Principia Mathematica, which shows the foundation of mathematics and logic. And in his later years, he developed a very comprehensive system. One of his principles is the fallacy of simple location, the idea that things are simply located. It's the idea that everything influences everything, that everything is, it goes, this is expressed very, very beautifully in Hinduism in the image of Indra's net. Indra, the god Indra, has this net that is full of all kinds of little particles of light. And so everything that exists is caught up in this net. And so if you pull the net over here, there are ripples of influence moving throughout the whole universe, throughout all of reality. So those kinds of philosophical systems, going back to Plato, to the Neoplatonic philosophers like Plotinus, who was a profound mystic, coming up to people like Hegel and the other idealist philosophers. Those philosophical systems are more conducive to presenting an explanation for these kinds of near-death experiences than the strictly materialistic systems, which say that reality is nothing but atoms in motion and that the mind is nothing but a product of a complex material machine. Descartes doesn't help. Cartesian dualism is a real problem because what Descartes said is that there's the mind and there's the body, and they're completely separate. That being the case, he never was able to really show how they can interact, and they do interact. And much of philosophy since the time of Descartes, since the time of those rationalist philosophers, has been sort of held hostage to the Cartesian dualism, which near-death experiences and idealistic philosophies and the Whiteheadian philosophy of organism support. So, if you really want to get into some abstract stuff, then you would have to turn to some of the idealistic philosophers. Or non-dualism, monism, non-dualism, yeah. Because the people who have these experiences experience a kind of ineffable feeling of all-encompassing love, and they lose a sense of a separation between themselves and the divine. And so that goes into a kind of metaphysics. Metaphysics is a theory of reality in philosophy. It goes into a metaphysics that is monistic or non-dualistic. It goes into the kind of philosophy you find in the Advaita Vedanta of Sri Shankaracharya in the Indian tradition. There are philosophers in many different traditions: Chinese, Indian, Native American Indian, Islamic, that support and give a context to explain these kinds of experiences. Well, especially the Sufis. We've been reading Rumi every Sunday for the past several years, and Rumi is a good example of the kind of mystical thinker who would be quite accepting of near-death experience accounts, I think. But I think there are quite a few thinkers across cultures who are dealing with these kinds of mystical experiences in ways that are compatible with their cultural understanding. And see, the problem with mystical experiences, the problem with the near-death experience is they're ineffable. They cannot be communicated in language. So any attempt to put them into a linguistic net will falsify them. And yet the only way we can communicate is through language. So if you look at the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, he says, "He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know." And yet he wrote this little book. It's full of paradoxes and riddles and apparent contradictions, but he still wrote it in an attempt to somehow point in a direction towards something that can never be captured in a network of language. And I think you have this idea of just so many different traditions, whether it's Buddhism, Taoism, some of the systems of ancient China, in Greek philosophy, in Plato, for example, especially in Plato, in the Hellenistic philosophies of people like Plotinus. So if you are inclined to think abstractly and to get into philosophy, I think you can certainly find places where these near-death experiences have a nice little home, and you can sort of work out the larger context for them. There's an interesting book by Rudolf Otto, Mysticism East and West, which is a comparison of Meister Eckhart, the Rhineland mystic, who talks about the Ungrund, the unground, God, the God beyond God, and Shankara, who is one of the major philosophies of Hinduism, one of the philosophers of Hinduism. And Otto shows that they're basically talking about the same thing. They're talking about things you can't talk about, but they're talking about the same thing. Eckhart is a good example of a thinker, philosopher, theologian, however you want to categorize him, who's dealing with these kinds of experiences. And certainly in my dissertation, when I looked at the near-death experience, I was taking it as a legitimate example of the ineffable mystical experience, kind of thing that both James and Royce talk about in their writing. I think what we have really been talking about more than anything is how to sort of pull back from the specifics of these accounts to try to see them in a larger context. And that's sort of the kind of thing that I would do as an ex-philosophy professor. Although, I'm interested in the experience, but I also want to see what it might mean and how it can be contextualized and how it relates to experiences in other cultures, in other religions. So our conversation has been a little different, but I think it's valuable to try to look at the near-death experience from a broader perspective. I think that in a way it may even strengthen the idea that these experiences are legitimate, authentic experiences of that, what James calls that something more beyond just ordinary consciousness. Yes, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and was a member of St. Philip's Cathedral, Episcopal Church in the Buckhead area of Atlanta. And I attended until I was about 15 or 16. And around that time, I started having lots of reservations about the religion. I saw some things that I didn't like. I saw a lot of hypocrisy in the church. And I was very lucky because during my senior year of high school, although I didn't really take the religion very seriously, I did attend Sunday school, and it was taught by the then editor of the Atlanta Constitution, Ralph McGill, who was a Pulitzer Prize winner. He was very active in the early civil rights movement and got into a lot of controversy because of that. But he was a wonderful Sunday school teacher. He certainly wasn't your typical Sunday school teacher. He talked about all kinds of things. And he had visited the Holy Land. He talked a lot about that. And it was just a really good experience for me. I don't think that it changed my view of the religion at all. But from that point on, I was not affiliated with any organized religion and didn't subscribe to any particular religious belief. Although I was always interested in religion. I remember when I was in high school, I took a course in which we had to interview someone who was a member of religion other than the religion that we were familiar with or belonged to. And I interviewed a woman who was a Seventh-day Adventist, and I was really fascinated by her account of her understanding of her religion. Later on, when I became a philosophy student, I took lots of courses in religion. And ultimately, when I became a philosophy professor, I taught a number of courses in religion. One of my favorite courses was world religions. I also taught courses in the religious philosophies of India and China, in the philosophies of Christianity, and several other kinds of courses that really dealt with religious issues. So it's always been an interest. What we ordinarily experience. Every now and then, things are going to break through. And they may break through in a very quick and mild way, like a deja vu experience. I did read an account of a deja vu experience that I thought was very interesting. The person was in Italy, in a small Italian village, and as they were walking through the square, they realized that they'd been there before. They had this profound deja vu experience. And they turned to the person they were with and they said, I feel that I have been here before. This was their first trip to Italy. Never been to Italy before. I never really knew much about this little town. And they said, you know what? If we walk down the street here and take a right, there's a beautiful little church. Let's do that. They walked down the street, they turned right, and there was a beautiful little church. Now, how do you explain that? Someone like Ian Stevenson might say, well, that's some suggestion that there might be reincarnation, that this person actually lived in that village in a previous existence, and that somehow being there triggered this memory that was very deeply within them about that church. How do you explain that? So, there are these kind of breakthrough experiences that people have that they may discount or that may be very significant. And if they are profound, like a near-death experience, may be transformative. I had a very powerful dream when I was a teenager, and it's never left me. And I can't explain it. It was around Christmas time, and I didn't have a lot of money, and I needed to buy presents for my family. And one night, I went to sleep, and we doing okay? Yeah. I went to sleep, and I had a dream that on my bedside table was a glass. And in my dream, I was imagining a musical chord. And that the musical chord somehow was projected onto that water in that glass. And it formed an ice crystal that was really beautiful. And it was vibrating, and it was emitting light, and it was emitting the sound of the musical chord. And I woke up, and I had this incredibly eerie feeling. I was probably 14 or 15 years old. This eerie feeling. It was like, it was an earthly feeling. And then I fell back to sleep, and I had a long dream that I was creating musical ice crystals by imagining musical chords, and they exhibited certain mathematical relationships and crystalline structures, and as I was creating more and more complicated ones. So I went from a C tonic chord to a C augmented 7 to an augmented 9, and I was creating all these incredibly complicated ice crystals that I was going to give to my family members as Christmas presents. That dream has never left me. And I realized it was what Jung calls a big dream. It was a prophetic dream. It was a dream that, in retrospect, told me that I was going to be a philosophy professor, that I was going to be very attracted to philosophers like Plato and Plotinus and Eckhart. It was a very Pythagorean dream, because Pythagoras talks about the music of the spheres. He talks about everything is made of number. We know that mathematics and music are interface. How would I know about that at 14 or 15 years old? Why did it mean so much to me? Why did it make me feel so weird when I woke up? We have these kinds of dreams that seem to be a kind of a larger consciousness breaking through the narrow confines of this little ego. And James talks about this as a sea of consciousness out there. There's a kernel in James's philosophy of idealism, although he doesn't want to embrace it fully, but it's there. Because when you start talking about reality as this all-encompassing consciousness, that is metaphysical idealism, the idea that ultimate reality is spirit or consciousness. And I used to think when I read Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit, that Hegel had written that very, very abstract work so that we could, in a sense, climb a ladder up to an ultimate kind of mystical realization that all is consciousness, all is spirit. And I guess that's about it.